Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you so very much for your ongoing support. We couldn't do this without you. We have a very exciting discussion with Dan today, so I want to hurry up and get Dan up here on the screen so you can ask him all the questions that you want when we have our Q&A discussion in about 20-25 minutes. Jessica will be managing your questions as usual. Dan has 3 terrific topics for you today. The morning headlines, and I think he has something special in mind for you to choose there. Second, soccer moms and NASCAR dads. Who are the voters who will decide the election? And third, the election night viewing guide. Key states, key races, and key indicators. I can't wait, Dan. So I'm going to turn this over to you because we want to hear completely from you. Thank you.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. We've now been holding these programs every week, these webinars, for almost 7 months. And it's really remarkable how close we now are to the election. There's 4 days until Election Day, and obviously still a tremendous amount of campaign activity ahead of us. But after 7 months of conversations each week, this is our last conversation, at least before the election. And while we'll be back again next Thursday to sift through the results, and on Tuesday, for those of you who are around, I'm holding an Election Day discussion with Todd Purdom, the very, very smart and savvy journalist who over the years has worked for the New York Times, for the Atlantic, and many others, to talk through Election Day itself. But today is our last conversation before the election. And so there's a few things we want to cover today. First, as Kim mentioned, we often, on the emails that we send all of you, one of our 3 topics says the morning headlines. And I'll admit to you that's usually just a placeholder, because when Claire and Jessica and I put together those topics each week right after our show, we don't really know what's going to be in the news 5 or 6 days later. So the day's headlines is sort of just a way of us cheating a little bit to give us some flexibility and some running room before each week's program. But today we thought we would take it literally. And what we're going to do, and I'm going to ask Claire in just a moment, to put up 4 headlines from this morning's newspapers on screen. And I'm going to ask each of you to choose which of the 4 you think is the most important one. All 4 of these headlines appeared somewhere in a major daily newspaper around the country. And so, Claire, let's put the headlines up and let's let our group decide which are the most important ones. So which of these headlines do you think is the most important 4 days before the election? Headline number 1, COVID cases surge in 41 states. Headline number 2, U.S. economy grows at record rate in 3rd quarter. Headline 3, new CNN poll shows Biden with 55% favorable ratings. And headline number 4, Saturday's Wisconsin versus Nebraska football game canceled. And yes, as many of you know by now, I am a cheesehead, so you know how I'll vote on this one. But let's see what the rest of you think. And so, Claire, let's put up these answers. 74% say that the COVID surge is the most important story of the day. 13% say the economy is. 12% say the new CNN poll, and 1%. Oh my gosh, there's a handful of you out there who, with me, are paying attention to the college football landscape. But I'll explain in just a second. That last headline, the Badgers versus the Cornhuskers, is a little bit more important than it first appears. So a few things going on with these headlines. Number 1, as we've talked about now for weeks, if not months, in each of the key swing states, we've seen some very clear trends in terms of public opinion polling. And even now that the polls are getting a little bit closer in some of those states, those broader trends have not changed at all. And the most notable trend is that when voters say that the coronavirus is the most important issue to them in this election year, those voters in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in swing states around the country, voters who say the coronavirus is the most important issue to them support Biden in overwhelming, historically unprecedented numbers. So if you think that the virus is the most important story, and I think that gives us a hint as to how at least most of our viewers are in the Los Angeles area, how all of you are thinking. But voters who think that the virus is the most important issue, they're going to vote for Biden in absolutely immense numbers. But one of the reasons that Trump has been able to keep the polls close is because in these same swing states, voters who say that the economy is the most important issue to them, they're voting for Trump in almost as large numbers. And so when people around the country wake up this morning and see in the headlines or see online one of those two headlines, the one they select as most important, tells you a lot about their voting tendencies. The third headline, as it relates to the Biden favorability, CNN polls out this morning, and it's a national poll, which, as we've talked about over the months, is not nearly as important to us now as statewide polling. But this CNN national poll shows Biden with a 12-point lead. And that's interesting, but what's much more important in that poll, it shows that when they ask voters how favorably or unfavorably they regard the candidates, Biden has a 55% favorable rating, which is his highest to date over the course of the year, and 42% unfavorable. On the flip side, Donald Trump has 41% favorable compared to 57% unfavorable. And one other comparison I'm going to put in there is 4 years ago in 2016, both Trump and Hillary Clinton on election day had about a 40% favorable rating and a 60% unfavorable rating. So not only is Biden's favorable significantly higher than Trump's, they're much higher than Clinton's were 4 years ago. And it's worth remembering, as we've talked about in the past, that those so-called double haters, the voters who didn't like either Clinton or Trump, voted for Trump by a pretty considerable margin 4 years ago. This year, there's a lot fewer double haters because Biden is much more popular than either Trump or Clinton was in 2016. But those voters, those who don't like either candidate, are now supporting Biden. So not a prediction on outcome, of course, but to me, the most telling statistic in this morning's CNN poll is that Biden's favorable ratings are well over 50%, which is going to make it much more difficult for Trump to take votes away from him in the closing days, the way he did from Clinton 4 years ago. So as we've talked about almost every week, this campaign is certainly not over. Doesn't make sense to make predictions at this point. But for any number of reasons, this among them, it appears that Biden is in a considerably stronger position today than Clinton was on the Thursday before the election 4 years ago. And on that Badger headline, my beloved Wisconsin football team was supposed to play Nebraska this weekend, and that game was canceled. And why was the game canceled? Because 12 members of the University of Wisconsin football program, including their head coach, their starting quarterback, and their backup quarterback, all tested positive for COVID this week. So if you live in the key swing state of Wisconsin, where Badger football is something close to a religion, what you're being reminded of every day for the next few days is that even if you've been fortunate enough that the pandemic has not touched you or your family or people you care about, it's in the headlines every day. And even if all those Wisconsin residents don't know the young men who play for the University of Wisconsin football team, they have a tremendous investment in them. You may remember earlier this fall how angry Donald Trump was when the Big Ten football conference decided not to play its games and how hard he pressured them to go ahead and play because he understood that in this region of the country, college football is extremely important in a way that it generally isn't here in California. And Trump, felt that those games being played signaled a return to normalcy, that we were getting past the COVID. The fact that Wisconsin voters and Wisconsin football fans are not going to have a game to watch this weekend, that's going to drive a lot of them, and already has driven a lot of them, into answering our first question in a way that most of you did, putting the coronavirus as the most important issue to them. So let's move on now. And what we're going to do here on Election Day is I'm going to spend a few minutes offering a little bit of a history lesson. Because all year long, we've talked about a few key voter groups in this election. And what I want to do, though, before we get into talking about a few of them in particular, is once again, I'm going to ask Claire to step in and put up our second poll question. and to ask you to tell all of us, which voter groups do you think will be most important in deciding the presidential election next week? Do you think it will be the white working class men? Will it be suburban women? Will it be seniors, older voters? Will it be young people, millennials and Gen Z? Or will it be voters from communities of color, African American and Latino and Asian Pacific voters? Which of those 5 groups do you think will be most important in next week's elections outcome? Well, look at that, 5% say white working class men, 40%, wow, 40% say suburban women. And then we've got quite a division here. 24% say young people, 15% say seniors, and 16% say voters from minority communities, from communities of color. Well, I'm not going to agree or disagree with your assessment, but I'm going to talk about 2 of these groups for the next few minutes because they're among, like all 5 of these groups, they're among the most important groups who are going to help decide next week's election. But there are 2 that bring some real historical relevance to it, and I do want to try to provide some historical perspective over the next few minutes. So working class white men and suburban women have been considered for most of the campaign the 2 most important swing votes in the election. Young people and voters from minority communities are generally considered to be part of the Democratic base, and there's a real challenge for Democrats to motivate them. Older voters, as we've talked about earlier, largely because of the pandemic, have shifted in very, very large numbers from Biden to Trump over the course of the year. There's also some increasing evidence that senior voters are not particularly pleased when Trump maligns Biden for what Trump argues is Biden's diminished mental faculties or facilities, excuse me. But we're going to talk for a few minutes. I want to talk about these suburban women and these white working class men, because for those of you who've followed politics closely over the years, you know there's nothing really new here. These 2 groups have dominated American politics in a really interesting way for decades. And I hope you won't mind if we take a step back to discuss this from a historical context to see how we arrived at this point. So back when I was getting involved in politics all those years ago, the single most important demographic indicator in how someone would vote, single most important demographic indicator was their income. The more money you made, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote Democrat. And what that meant for many, many years is voters who lived in America's suburbs tended to be economically successful enough to afford to live out in the suburbs, and therefore tended to be somewhat more conservative economically. They were considered to be very, very reliable Republican votes. So from the first days of Levittown in New York and Orange County's emergence here in California, the suburbs were a Republican bastion. And working class voters, union voters, blue collar workers, given the strength of organized labor in this country through the first 3 quarters plus of the 20th century, tended to be among the most loyal Democratic voters. And then in the 1990s, a generation or so ago, that began to change. So in the 1990s, a group of savvy Democrats led by Bill Clinton, the Democratic nominee for president in 1992, he began to reach out to these suburban voters. And his argument was essentially, I'm not one of those old-fashioned tax and spend liberal Democrats who you don't like, Mr. and Mrs. Suburbanite. I'm more fiscally responsible. I'm more economically moderate. And since I'm economically responsible, and since the Republicans are too, maybe, Bill Clinton said, you suburban voters can support me not based on your economic interests, but instead on a range of social and cultural issues instead. Sometimes those issues were topics like education and healthcare and the environment. Sometimes they were more specific, issues like abortion rights and gun control. But what Clinton did is he helped the Democrats reach out to those suburban voters in a historically unprecedented way. And for those of you with long memories, you know that those voters were dubbed back in the 1990s as soccer moms, and to be fair, soccer dads, soccer parents who lived in the suburbs and drove their children to soccer practice in their minivans. And Clinton, Dianne Feinstein, any number of Democrats over the next 20 years stole these soccer moms out from under the Republican Party, got them to vote on social and cultural issues rather than on economic matters, and built a majority that elected Clinton president twice. Now, Republicans didn't just sit still and let this happen, because what a group of smart Republicans did, people like Newt Gingrich and Karl Rove and others, is at the same time the Democrats were reaching out to soccer moms, the Republicans began aggressively communicating with a group that was became known as NASCAR dads. And just like a soccer mom or soccer dad ostensibly drove their children to soccer practice in the suburbs, a NASCAR dad or a NASCAR mom was a working class voter who, in their free time, their recreational activity, involved going to NASCAR, to car races. And just as the Democrats appealed to the soccer parents on social and cultural issues, Republicans did the same thing. And what Republicans did, just in the absolute reverse dynamic, as we saw with Democrats, is they reached out to these NASCAR parents, to these working class voters, and said, rather than voting on your economic interests, why don't you vote on cultural and social issues on which we agree? Issues like abortion and guns, and as the years passed, marriage equality. So through the 90s and the 2000s and the early part of last decade, gradually, little by little, the two major parties engineered a huge major trade in which they traded soccer moms for NASCAR dads. And gradually, little by little, these economically successful but socially moderate and socially liberal suburbanites switched from being reliable Republican voters to swing voters to now very reliable Democratic voters. And at the same time that these white working class voters, economic populists but socially conservative, gradually shifted from becoming loyal Democratic voters to swing voters. And now we're seeing that more and more frequently, they line up very reliably with Republicans. But Donald Trump didn't invent this trend, this trade-off of driving suburbanites into the other party and bringing working class voters into his party. But as is the case with so many other political dynamics that we see on the landscape these days, while he didn't create that dynamic, he intensified it. One quick other demographic point before we move on. I mentioned how way back in the 80s, before the Democrats started reaching out to soccer parents and the Republicans started talking to NASCAR parents, the single most important demographic indicator for an individual's partisan voting behavior was their income. That's not the case anymore. The single most reliable demographic indicator for voters in terms of which way they'll vote is no longer financial. Rather, it's what the political scientists call religiosity. Not the religious faith that you practice, Catholic or Methodist or Jewish or Muslim or any other, but rather the intensity with which you practice it. And what we've seen over the last few election cycles, once again intensified under Trump, is that voters who attend religious services, church or synagogue once a week or more, are far more likely to vote Republican than Democrat. And those voters who attend church or synagogue once a month or less are much more likely to vote Democrat. So here we sit in 2020, almost 30 years after Bill Clinton first started reaching out to these soccer moms, and a quarter of a century after Republicans started talking to NASCAR dads. And we're seeing that this switch is pretty much complete. And the Democrats have won over the suburbs, despite Donald Trump's protestations in recent weeks. And the Republicans have largely secured support from these NASCAR parents. And one of the reasons that Biden is favored to win the election next week is because he's one of the last members of the Democratic Party nationally who still has an ability to talk to those voters in a way that some of his younger colleagues don't. So think of this as, if not the culmination, the extension of a long time developing political and demographic set of trends. And it may help Tuesday night when we watch the elections come in, and when in the days ahead we see how different demographic groups voted, to keep in mind that this is trending that's been going on for a long, long time. So last thing I want to do, and then we'll open it up to your questions, because as I've told you before, that's my favorite part of the webinar each week. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about what we should be watching on election night. There'll be all sorts of news coming in from all sorts of different sources. So how do you sift through it? And before I offer you my thoughts, once again, I'd like to hear yours. And so Claire, if you can put up the next question, which state will you be watching most closely on election night? And we'll make this a presidential question. So which state will you be watching most closely on election night in terms of the presidential race? It'll be Pennsylvania, it'll be Michigan, Will it be Wisconsin, the 3 states that decided the campaign 4 years ago? Florida, the historic swing state? Or Arizona, a historically Republican state that Democrats are contesting very aggressively? Plenty of other states to watch too. But of these 5, which will you be paying closest attention to when the results come in? Claire, let's see what everybody says. Now look at that, 56%, more than half of us are going to be paying attention to the state of Florida. And there's some justification for that, because if Biden can win Florida back from Trump, then it becomes very, very difficult for Trump to win the election unless he virtually sweeps the rest of the swing states. Pennsylvania, 34%, a little bit more than a third. And that makes sense too, because of those 3 upper Midwestern states, Pennsylvania is the largest and right now seems to be the one that's most closely contested. And Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan, not so much. We'll be paying attention, but not nearly to the same degree as we will to Florida and Pennsylvania. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to broaden the playing field a little bit for all of us, and then we'll go to your questions in just a minute. Can't pay attention to 50 states all at once. That's really not fair. But for those of you who are really going to be watching this carefully on election night, I'd suggest to you that roughly 1/4 of the states are worth at least keeping one of your eyes on. And yes, I realize that's 12 or 13 eyes, Claire and Jessica, and nobody has that many eyes, but stick with me on this anyway. So what are those states? So first of all, you have 6 states that Donald Trump carried 4 years ago, that if he doesn't win them all this year, is going to spell real trouble for him. Those states, and these are states that he won by a fairly safe margin. Florida is one of them, just as many of you mentioned. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Ohio. Those are the 4 Eastern time zone states that Trump needs to win if he's going to be reelected. Again, he still can be theoretically, but it'll be very, very difficult for him to win if he does not win one of those 4 states on election night. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Ohio. And unlike Pennsylvania and Michigan, also in the Eastern time zone, which we'll talk about in just a minute, it's reasonable to expect that those states will have results on election night. And so those are 4 states to watch in the first hour or so after the polls start closing on election night, 8 p.m. out there, 5 p.m. here in California. The other 2 states to watch that Trump carried by safe margins last year or 4 years ago, once the battleground shifts to the central time zone, when the polls begin to close at 9 o'clock Eastern time, 6 o'clock in California, keep your eye on the state of Iowa and the state of Texas. Trump carried both of those states by about 9 points 4 years ago. His margin in Texas was much lower than it had been historically for Republicans, and Iowa somewhat higher. But it's notable that tomorrow, with 3 days to go in the campaign, Joe Biden is campaigning in Iowa, and Kamala Harris is campaigning in Texas, which suggests to me that the Biden-Harris campaign thinks that they have the ability to pull off an upset in one of those 2 places. And if Biden were to win either of those states, either Texas or Iowa, at that point, you can probably go to sleep early, because while statistically it's possible for Trump to win, winning without those 2 states would be very, very difficult. Then you've got what need to be considered the 4 top swing states right now. These are the 3 we've talked about before, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as opposed to the newly emerged swing state of Arizona. Because of ballot counting rules in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and Wisconsin, it's unlikely that we'll see results from those states on election night. But if any of those states are called on Tuesday night, that means that it was not a close race. In a close campaign in any of those states, we could be waiting days for results. But if the powers that be were to make a call in any of those key 3 states on election night, that probably means a very sizable Biden victory, which would carry over not from these states, just through these states, but throughout the country. And then finally, for those of you who got a little bit of extra bandwidth, pay attention to New Hampshire, into Nevada, into Minnesota. These states don't get as much attention. These are states that Clinton carried 4 years ago, all the other states that I've mentioned were states that were carried by Trump. But those three Clinton states, New Hampshire, Nevada, and Minnesota, are Trump's best, if only, possibilities to make up ground that he lost in 2016. And if he were to win any one of these three states, then I think you can assume it's a much more closely contested election. Lastly, for just a minute or two, I want to go back to the conversation we started last week about the Senate races to watch. I did my best a week ago to give you an overview of the Senate campaigns around the country, the 14 key ones, and then those within that group that are even most important. But we ran out of time before I was able to talk about what to watch for on election night. So if you're watching as I am to see which party controls the Senate come next year, 4 states in particular are going to play an instrumental role in deciding that outcome. The states of Colorado and Arizona and Maine all have Republican incumbents, all of whom are states that the Democratic challenger is heavily favored to win. The state of Alabama, with a Democratic incumbent, is a state that the Republicans very likely to win. So if you were to integrate those into your thinking, given that Republicans currently have 53 seats in the United States Senate, and Democrats and their independent allies have 47, if those 4 races, Colorado, Arizona, Maine, and Alabama, all go as predicted, then Republicans will have a 51-49 advantage in the US Senate. Now, there are 9 other states, and I mentioned them last week, and I'll just run through them very quickly here for all of you. 9 states currently held by Republicans that appear to be competitive. And if any one of these switches to Democratic, then it is a 50-50 tie. And if Biden wins, then Vice President Kamala Harris would break that tie in the Senate. So those Republican seats are Alaska, 2 seats in Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Montana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas. All of those are held by Republicans. And if any one of them goes Democratic, then I think you do see a 50-50 tie, or if more do, then a Democratic majority. So on election night when there's a lot going on, what should you be watching for in terms of the Senate? Well, in the Eastern time zone, I'd encourage you to keep your eye on 2 states. Keep an eye on the state of South Carolina, where Lindsey Graham, the incumbent who is heavily favored at the beginning of this year, is now in the fight of his life against the Democratic challenger, Jamie Harrison. And if Harrison pulls off the upset there, then I think you can assume with some confidence the Democrats will end up with a majority in the Senate. And the other state to keep an eye on in the Eastern time zone is the state of Michigan, where there's a Republican challenger, a man by the name of John James, running against the incumbent Gary Peters. That's probably the only race in the country other than Alabama where Republicans have the opportunity to pull off an upset to defeat an incumbent Democrat. And if that happens, if James were to beat Peters in Michigan, then I think it becomes much more likely that Republicans do hold the Senate. Let's do this, though. We're coming up on 11:30, and I really do want to get to your questions. So Claire, maybe we can run through the last few questions with the group, get their opinions, and then Jessica can come in and we can answer some of the more specific questions. So I'm going to ask you guys for some predictions here. First, and most importantly, who do you predict will win the presidential race? Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or other? And if you say other, I'll be fascinated to find out your thinking on that. What kind of results are we getting for this one, Claire? 95% of our group, wow, 95% of our group thinks that Joe Biden is going to win on Tuesday night. That's a prediction, not a preference. So that's really, really interesting. The next question. Not surprisingly, we're asking you which party you think will have the majority in the US Senate in January. Will the Republicans maintain control for the reasons I mentioned earlier? Or as we talked about a moment ago, is it more likely the Democrats will will knock off one of those 9 incumbent Republicans we talked about? What do we get on this one? 79% say Democrats, only 21% say Republicans. So far it's looking like a pretty good night for the Democrats. Let's put up our last question, see how this one comes out. Which party do you think will have the majority in the US House in January? Donald Trump says Republicans. Kevin McCarthy does, and I think those are the only people in Washington I know who are making that prediction. But let's see what this group thinks. And I worry that I might have just put my thumb on the scale, and yes, I believe I did. 98% of you believe that Democrats will maintain control of the House of Representatives. 3% say Republicans. So thank you very much, Claire. And boy, Jessica, that's a lot of information to digest. So let's move on from our polling questions to smart questions from our audience members. How about that?
Sounds good. Well, I have one question for you to start. How do you take in election day / night? I envision you in like a war room. You've got screens everywhere and there's maps on the wall, and then you're like gaming it out somehow. So what do you do for election night?
Oh my gosh, you make me sound like some kind of mad political scientist.
Yes.
I'll keep the TV on, usually on a broadcast station, not a cable station, and I'll keep my laptop in front of me, and I'll keep an eye. The website that I prefer to watch on election night is the Politico website, but you really can't go wrong with any of the major media organizations. And Jessica, I know that for major political events, you have an exercise regimen that,
yes, I do.
that you involve in. For us more sedentary people, we're going to envy but not duplicate. So I hope the results are in early for you. Otherwise, you could just be exhausted by the time they finally settle things.
Well, that's usually on the debate nights, and then for election night, then it's like gigantic pizza, all the carbs, all the sugary stuff. So yeah, that's a celebration night for all the nights of debate. I've got to work up to it.
That sounds much better. So let's see what kind of questions do we have?
Sure. So we're getting a lot of questions about the Supreme Court and their influence on the election and some of the decisions that they've been coming up with. So just a more broad question. I'm concerned about how involved the Supreme Court is in the election. Please discuss.
Okay. Well, as we've talked about in previous webinars, there's no question that any number of disagreements are going to end up being settled by the courts and ultimately by the Supreme Court in this election cycle. I think it's been widely assumed that conservative justices outnumbering their liberal colleagues 5-3, and now with Barrett's confirmation 6-3, that any number of people have been greatly concerned that they might try to put their thumb or their elbow or their whole bodies on the scale on behalf of the president. But just in the last day or so, we've seen a more complicated picture emerge, because while on some matters, the court has ruled somewhat predictably in favor of Republican concerns, generally which have ended up either restricting the counting of ballots that arrive after Election Day and some voting access questions. Just yesterday, we saw two Supreme Court decisions, one in Pennsylvania, one in North Carolina, in which the Supreme Court, by a 5-3 margin, Roberts and Kavanaugh voting with the three Democrat-appointed justices, voting to allow ballots that come in after Election Day to be counted in the key swing states of Pennsylvania and North Carolina. The way John Roberts, the Chief Justice, has explained the difference on this, because as all of you know, in some of the other cases, in other states, they've ruled not to allow ballots that are postmarked by November 3rd, but not in by then to be counted. Roberts says it's a matter of respecting state decision-making authority. So when he voted to overrule the lower court's decision in Wisconsin to allow late arriving ballots to be counted, he was overruling a federal judge, albeit one further down the food chain. But in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the decisions do extend the days that those ballots could come in. 3 days, I believe, in Pennsylvania, 9 days, if I'm not mistaken, in North Carolina. He said those decisions were made by state authorities, either elected or appointed officials, and therefore he felt that the U.S. Supreme Court should defer to them. So there's plenty of reason to wonder how the court will act as these decisions come in. But the fact is that we have seen Roberts and Kavanaugh on some of these decisions vote with the Democratic appointed justices, though not on all of them, makes it a murkier picture than I think many people might have predicted even just a week ago.
Thank you. The LA Times had an article about college students who have to vote in their home states rather than at college like they usually do. How much do you think quirks like this in the days of COVID will affect the election?
So this is a challenge for Democrats because one of their most reliable tools for turning out college students to vote, who particularly in this era vote in very large margins for Democratic candidates, the way they do it is by running voter drives on campus where the students cluster. And because those students are either in their home states or even if they're in the town where their college exists, they're sitting in an apartment as opposed to out interacting with the rest of the student body, motivating and mobilizing all those young people to vote becomes a very difficult logistical challenge for Democratic parties in those key swing states. So if you think about those states, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Michigan, Penn State University, University of Florida, and Florida State University, these are tens of thousands of votes, some from in-state, some from not. And it's just a lot harder to contact those tens of thousands of people in tens of thousands of apartments in hometowns rather than in one place where they physically gather. It's clear that the Democratic Party and the Biden campaign has put a very large amount of resources into this type of voter contact, online, texting, and phone, but it is a more difficult challenge than the more traditional online, or in-person mobilization efforts. And if the Democrats do come up short next Tuesday, it's entirely possible that the distancing decisions that most major universities have, I think, appropriately decided should be the case for their student bodies, that could end up being a contributing factor.
Thank you. This next questioner asked or said, I've seen an upswell in young people for a change more than before, I think with an absentee voting and an early voting. Is his reading correct?
It is correct. We are seeing more young people voting early in this election than we did in 2016. But all public opinion polls show that there's a greater level of interest in the election among young people than there was in 2016. The challenge with early voting is it's really, in terms of extrapolating outcomes from it, is it's very alluring. Think, oh my gosh, I don't want to wait until next Tuesday to find out who's going to win. So maybe I can just look at the early numbers to see who's turning out, and I can decide now. The problem is no one has figured out a reliable way of ascertaining whether someone who votes by mail or who delivers their ballot early, whether they're someone who would not have voted had that early opportunity not been available, or is it simply someone who's voting early rather than on election day? Some of the polls do ask those early responders, if you will, if they are first-time voters, and we are seeing a notable rise in the number of first-time voters, but we really can't project for election until election day what that's going to mean. But all the way back to the original question, we are seeing young people participating in larger numbers, just like we're seeing everybody of all ages participating in larger numbers. So it's encouraging that young people are more engaged, but it's certainly not disproportional for the millennial and Gen Z generation. It's something we're seeing at every age level this year.
Thank you. Going back to the Supreme Court, some fear that based on his comments on Monday, Brett Kavanaugh is prepared to help Trump steal the election. What do you think?
I don't know. I thought that Kavanaugh's comments about flipping the vote or flipping the outcome with votes that come in after election day, regardless of when they were postmarked, they were at the very least inartfully worded, because Kavanaugh is smart enough to know, regardless of ideology, that you can't flip an election result. In other words, you can't reverse a result until all the eligible votes are counted. So I think the point that he was trying to make is not that an election result would be reversed, but rather that these late arriving ballots, could cause some level of confusion. As it happens, I don't agree with him on that. And I was concerned by his comments, not by his word choice, because I think he just made bad word choices. But I was concerned that he somehow or other saw late arriving ballots as lacking merit, lacking value. But then he votes with Roberts and the 3 Democratic appointed justices yesterday on the North Carolina and Pennsylvania case. And I'm not positive on this, I don't think he offered a separate opinion from Roberts, which leads me to believe that he agrees with the Chief Justice, that at least in his mind, unlike that of Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas, that if a state entity has made a decision, the US Supreme Court should respect it. So somewhat concerned, like the questioner was, by his responses, by his analysis on Monday. But his votes yesterday in those 2 key states suggest that it's not an ironclad rule everywhere. That you've got 3 justices appointed by Democratic presidents who are going to almost always vote for increased voter access. You have 3 justices all appointed by Republicans who are almost always going to vote in the other direction. That leaves, and then that leaves Kavanaugh and Roberts as the swing votes on this. And already this week, we've seen both Roberts and Kavanaugh vote in both directions. So as we talked about last week, that deference to state decision-making authority seems to be what drives them, but we'll have plenty of more opportunities in the days ahead and possibly weeks ahead to see if that thesis still holds.
Thank you. This questioner says, Dan, how concerned are you about a disputed election? And I know I've been talking to Claire about this a little bit because the Gore-Bush election was the first one that I voted in, and of course I got to watch that be contested. She was too young. So what is that going to be like for this generation, and how concerned about it are you?
Well, I am concerned about it. The best analyses I've read suggest that there is just as likely to be a Biden landslide as a narrow Trump victory, which means an election that either leans slightly toward Biden or indeed is too close to call. Certainly is a possibility. Given that the margins in the polls in most of these states is somewhat larger than they were in 2016, I don't think it's a probability, but it's a strong possibility. And it's one that we need to be aware of. All of you who watch this webinar on a regular basis know that a point that I've made constantly throughout our meetings, and I'll ask you this one last time, is if you participate in webinars like this one, you know that the lack of a final result on Tuesday night is not a bad thing. It just means that the authorities are taking their time to make sure the ballots are counted in an accurate and responsible way. But public opinion polls still show that there's a good quarter of the American electorate that does believe that we'll have results on election night. And if that ends up not being the case, it's those people who are expecting results, final results, who will likely be the cause of panic and fear and possibly even unrest. So the one thing I would ask all of you between now and Tuesday, aside from, of course, casting your ballot, is to talk to people who pay less attention to these things than you do, and without even trying to convince them to vote for your preferred candidate. I know that's tempting, but I'd ask you to put that aside now. And instead, even more importantly, help them understand that while it'll be great if there were a final result on Tuesday night, if there's not, that's no reason for concern. It's no reason for panic. So I wouldn't have been offering that reminder so constantly over the last several weeks if I didn't think there were a possibility of a contested election. If it ends up being the case, I can pretty much guarantee you that one of our 3 topics next week is going to be how it gets resolved going forward. But for now, I know that we've talked about this in the past. Each state will have until the first week of December to conclude its own election results. And if it's not able to, then at least according to the Constitution, the decision cedes to Congress. Longer conversation on that should it become necessary next week. But for now, let's just say, while I don't think it's a probability, I think it's a possibility. And the most important thing any of us can do between now and Tuesday is make sure our friends, our neighbors, our family members, our co-workers understand that it is a possibility for which we should be prepared.
Thank you. Yeah, I have been seeing on social media, they've been putting a banner at the top saying exactly that the election results will likely not be in on election night. So just to prepare for that. But I also think a lot of us are looking for a reprieve from the election too. So
we're looking for a reprieve, but it's also habit. You know, in a television, in an internet era, we're used to having results on election night. Right. There aren't a lot of Americans left who followed political campaigns before the advent of television. And so if this does take an extra few days or few weeks, that's simply reverting to a pre-mid-20th century historical norm.
Yeah, thank you. It now looks like Trump could lose the popular vote total by 7 percentage points and still squeak through the Electoral College. Clinton only won the popular vote by 2.1 points. How can the nation get through this kind of split result?
Well, I think there's two questions in there. One, which is for Biden supporters, how concerned should they be that Biden's lead in the national polls isn't sufficient? And the second question, one that we've addressed before, is the value of the Electoral College. So I'll try to answer both relatively quickly. The national polls, as we've talked about many, many times, really aren't that relevant at this point. And so the state-by-state polling, which, as I've noted in these key swing states, the margin is shrinking in some states, but I have noticed that in Wisconsin and Michigan, Biden's lead has been growing. So if Biden were to win the national vote by more than 7 points, it becomes almost impossible, just statistically, for Trump to win an Electoral College majority. If Biden were to win by 5, 6, or 7 points, it's theoretically possible, but it's unlikely. And like I said, the CNN poll this morning shows him up 12 points. Most national polls show Biden with a high single-digit or low double-digit lead, which is above 7, but not by, I think, what the questioner would consider to be a comfortable margin. But once again, a sizable Biden popular vote victory of that scale can only create a Trump electoral victory under very precise circumstances. The fact that states like Pennsylvania and Florida and Georgia are so close right now means that a 5, 6, 7 point victory for Biden almost certainly would mean an Electoral College victory. So just because something is statistically possible doesn't mean it's statistically likely. And so one of the reasons we broke down the states a few minutes ago before going to all of your questions was to remind you about where to keep your eye on election night, because obviously at that point we're not paying attention to national polls. And what I will say is this: is Trump. I mentioned 6 states earlier: Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Iowa, and Texas. If Trump loses any one of those states, it doesn't matter how large or small Joe Biden's popular vote margin is. If Trump loses one of those states, it becomes very, very difficult for him to be elected president. And right now, every single one of those 6 states, at state level polling, is within the margin of error. One candidate or the other ahead or behind by 2 points or less. As far as the Electoral College, we've talked about this before, and if it becomes necessary, we can come back to it again next week. But my short answer on that is, I think some of you have heard in the past, is I worry that getting rid of the Electoral College for a pure popular vote gives such a disproportionate amount of influence to a handful of the nation's largest cities that I think that actually exacerbates the divisions and polarization in the electorate rather than helping to solve them. But that's a conversation for next week, should it be necessary.
Thank you. This is a bit of a question on the Electoral College. What would be necessary to move the Electoral College from a win-lose per state to a proportional allocation by state? Wouldn't that be consistent with the idea of protecting the smaller states, but also better aligning to the national will? Further, it would mean that every state would be important to be contested.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately the best solution. Rather than completely eliminating the Electoral College and going to a pure popular vote, I think the questioner astutely suggests a nationwide system of the type that we now have in the states of Maine and the states of Nebraska, where each congressional district is decided winner take all, but each congressional district is one electoral vote, and the state is no longer winner take all. So theoretically, in a state like California with 53 districts, 40, 42, 43 of them could be Democratic, but 10, 11, 12 would be Republican. And in heavily leaning red states, there would still be pockets where the Democrats could pick up electoral votes. And I think the question is correct that while it'd be very, very difficult to make that change, I think that's an ideal compromise. And while there's no perfect solution, it does represent, I think, a better option than the two that are more commonly discussed.
Thank you. This questioner says, Dan, you did not mention Susan Collins. Why?
Oh, I didn't mention Susan Collins only because I was mentioning states and not names. But when I mentioned 4 Senate races, I talked about Colorado, Arizona, and Maine, where Collins is running for re-election against the Democratic legislative leader, Sarah Gideon, as 3 Senate seats currently held by Republicans, where the Democratic challenger was favored to win. So I didn't get into the details of the race, but I guess I would say this, since the question has come up, is that if Collins is reelected in Maine, we'll know that early in the evening, and that will bode well for Republicans' prospects for keeping the majority. But right now, Collins is the decided underdog. This is the most difficult race she's faced over her fairly long Senate career. And Gideon is considered to be not a sure thing, but a strong favorite at this point. And once again, if those 4 races that look most likely to switch, Colorado and Arizona and Maine from Republican to Democrat, and Alabama from Democrat to Republican, then we'd be left with a 51-49 split, and the Democrats trying to win 1 of 9 Republican seats elsewhere in the country. So it will be, even if the presidential race is decided early on Tuesday evening, which I don't think is all that likely, it would be even less likely that we'd know with any confidence which party controlled the Senate early on Tuesday night. One other quick point there, as I mentioned, that there are 2 Senate races taking place in the state of Georgia. One that the seat that's open on a normal timeline where David Perdue is running for re-election. But second, a special election where Senator Kelly Loeffler was appointed by the governor of Georgia to fill the seat of her predecessor who stepped down. The state of Georgia is one of the few states in the country which requires a candidate not just to get more votes than his or her opponent, but to win with more than 50% of the vote. And in both of those races right now, it looks more than possible that neither major party candidate would have a support of more than 50% of the electorate in November, which means Georgia is very, very likely to have a runoff election for certainly 1 and possibly 2 of its Senate seats in the first week of January. And that means that if the control of the Senate is not decided by the other 98 seats, we might end up waiting until the first week of January to see how Georgians vote to resolve their Senate races in a contested runoff or 2. So you might be up for a while.
What is the impact of the Supreme Court ending the census for future apportionment decisions?
Okay. I don't know that this is a precedent that will carry forward. The court was essentially deferring to the executive branch, which is technically in control of the census. But it's very difficult to believe, at least for me, I don't mean to sound like an ingenue, that a future president or future administration would try to interfere would try to interfere with the U.S. Census, as is the case for many matters these days. We're in a very unique situation. I think what we're seeing from the Trump administration on the census is something unlikely to be repeated by presidents of both parties. So I'd be surprised if this is a question that the court were to face again in the future. And if they did, I don't know how much weight this precedent would hold. There's still all sorts of unresolved questions about how this census is going to be completed, particularly if Trump is not reelected. But I don't see a great likelihood of impact on future censuses, and that might be a bit naive.
Thank you. How might problems with the post office impact post-election activities?
Well, the problems with the post office, we saw a federal judge order earlier this week post offices around the country to completely abandon the changes that were implemented over the summer in order to accelerate delivery. So the big issues with the post office are pre-election, which is, are the ballots going to get to the appropriate authorities on time? And so in all likelihood, we will have a large number of ballots that were postmarked by November 3rd but don't arrive by then. Here in California, we have an unusually forgiving law in the books, which says that a ballot that is postmarked by November 3rd can be accepted and counted up to 17 days after the election. Most states are not nearly that generous, and particularly in those states where there have been fights about whether to accept ballots postmarked by November 3rd that don't come in until days later. I think the speed with which the post office delivered pre-November 3rd ballots becomes the basis for the very large majority of court disputes. As we talked about earlier, Pennsylvania and North Carolina at least seem to have now a little bit of post-election day breathing room, but it's worth noting that in many states, including my home state of Wisconsin, Democratic Party officials in particular are urging their supporters not to send in their vote by mail anymore so close to the election, but rather to take them to an early voting location or to take them in on election day. And for anybody, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, the post office has said that they believe they can deliver ballots within 7 days of them being mailed. Since we're now inside that 7-day marker, I'd say that the advice the parties is giving is right, which is go to an early voting place if you can, or turn your ballot in on election day. But putting your ballot in the mailbox at this late date is probably not a very good idea.
Is there a threshold in some of these places where they'll have counted so many votes and they'll be able to call a county? Or, I mean, I'm assuming they might see we've got enough votes in and we can say that this is going to one candidate or the other, regardless of the votes still coming in.
Yeah, ultimately, the authorities never call an election until every vote is counted. If you are a local election official, Jessica, even if there's 1 million votes for my opponent and 1 vote for me, and only 10 votes left to be counted, you still don't announce anything until those last votes are counted. But for the media sources, primarily the Associated Press and the network consortium, they will call an election if they believe it is no longer statistically possible for the candidate running behind to catch up. So if you, Jessica, are 400,000 votes ahead of me, and there's only 390,000 ballots left to be counted, then they'll declare you the winner. But they're going to be that much more careful this year compared to years past, given the concerns we've been talking about today and in our previous weeks.
Great, thank you. Can I get one more question in? I know we're right at the end of the hour. Okay, so this will be our final question. If Trump should lose and claim voter fraud, how effective will that tactic be in upsetting results?
We don't know. First of all, I think it depends on how close the margin appears to be. If it looks like that Biden has won by a very large margin, then I don't know that Trump's claims will be taken nearly as seriously. But if it is too close to call, if it is a 2000 type election in which the margins are very, very tight, then Trump's calls for fraud are going to have not a substantive impact, but I'd say, for lack of a better word, a psychological impact. Let me explain it this way. The President of the United States has no role whatsoever, whether he or she is a Democrat or Republican, in counting ballots and determining elections state by state. No official role at all. So ultimately, these decisions are going to be made by local and state officials around the country. But, and I think this is the premise of the question, if either candidate were to decide to raise very loud and very confrontational arguments that the vote was invalid, it's the kind of thing that could really encourage that candidate's supporters to act out in a particularly difficult way. I am confident that by the time all the dust is settled, that there will be a transition either to a new president or a president being reelected. But it's entirely possible that not just on election day, but in the days following, that we could see a real level of protest and unrest of the type that we haven't seen related to an election in some time. I think the one thing I'd ask of all of you is, if that's the case, if Tuesday night, Wednesday, next Thursday, the election is still in question and we see people panicking, I guess the one appeal I'd make for all of us is, let's set an example. Let's demonstrate, if we demonstrate confidence in the process and in the system, it's much more likely that other people will follow our lead. Confidence is contagious and panic is contagious. And the more of us that keep our wits about us, even if we do end up in a particularly difficult or trying circumstance, the better example we'll set for others who are going to follow your example and follow your leadership. We saw during many of the protests this summer the challenge that law enforcement authorities had separating peaceful protesters from those intent on inciting some level of violence. Should that become the case in the next week ahead, I think the best thing to do for people who want a peaceful resolution is to stay calm, to stay off the streets, to make sure that those people who are intent on causing trouble are isolated and much more exposed. I hope we don't get there. But if it turns out that this is the kind of challenge that this country hasn't seen in some time, the type of person, I don't say this with any ego involved, the type of person who participates in the kind of programming that LA World Affairs Council Town Hall sponsors is the kind of person who can set an example for the rest of the community. So if it becomes necessary, let's keep our heads about us and let's show other people that panic isn't the way to get through. The courage and confidence is.
Thank you so much, Dan. Very good words for all of us, and hopefully that will resonate across the nation and people will keep their heads level. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to watching elections now that I've got all this extra information. And Kim, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much. Great job on the questions. Dan, 7 months of guiding us through this perilous journey or challenging journey. I have heard from so many of your viewers of your weekly program how essential you are as an anchor to all of us in guiding us through this unprecedented time. So from all of us, thank you so very much. I know it's not over, but thank you. And for all of you, please join us Tuesday. Dan has offered graciously to be with us on election day, same time, 11 o'clock, to guide us through the early results. And of course, next Thursday, we'll get into the nitty gritty, right, Dan?
Absolutely. I'll be looking forward to both Tuesday and Thursday. So I hope you'll all be able to join us.
Thank you, Dan, so very much. Please, thank you everybody for your ongoing support. Check our website. We have a lot of other terrific programs that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next Tuesday, Election Day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.